What I'm going to argue is that the prosperity that the world has experienced, I'm not necessarily specifically talking about developing countries at this stage, but there will be lessons for that. The prosperity that the world has experienced in the last 50 and 200 years has largely come about without planning. That it is essentially an emergent phenomenon, that it was essentially a side effect of things we did rather than the main reason, and that we have a general tendency in this world to look at things that happen and ascribe them to leadership and planning and intention and design more than is actually justified. And that we should strain to fight this tendency and to understand the phenomena of emergence and in particular of evolution. I'd like to start with this chart, which is world economic growth in the last, well, basically in my lifetime. But it's not all my doing. In fact, none of it's my doing, really. And that's kind of my point, is that who did achieve this? Who achieved this extraordinary, steady, five-fold increase in human prosperity, in the value of goods and services in the world over that 60 years? And why is it so steady? I'm very struck by this chart because it's tremendously steady, much steadier than the graph for any individual country. It's marching upwards at 3 to 5% a year. You can't really see, there are no recessions in it unless you count 2009, and even that has been revised away on latest figures, that it's no longer a dip. It was unfortunately the year I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist, but that was just unlucky. But since then, the upward march has resumed, again, bang on that line. What is causing this steady, incremental, inexorable, inevitable improvement in human living standards over that time? And why don't you see the effect of wars and recessions and other things on it? And if you go back even further, go back 500 years and look at it per capita, it's even more striking what has happened, and it's even more recent. That until the last 50 years, really very little had happened in terms of changing human living standards, after which it takes off like a rocket, and we don't really know why that is. We ascribe it to events that happened in the 18th century. We call them the Industrial Revolution. But where's the revolution on this chart? There is no change in human living standards in the 18th century, or if there is, it's very, very gradual and very, very slight. The conditions are put in place for something spectacular to happen later through accumulation and compounding. And of course, the impact of this has been to kill poverty to an extent that we could hardly believe possible. Not completely, of course. There are still 21% of people in the world today who are living at a level of $1.25 a day, which is an extraordinarily low level of poverty. So there's an awful long way to go. Nonetheless, there has been an astonishing progress in getting rid of poverty in much of the world. And we've done that largely as a side effect of the policies that we have adopted. With the exception of the Millennium Development Goals, this hasn't been the aim of the policies that have achieved this particularly. And it's happening on all continents. For a long time, it looked like Africa was going to get left behind in this process. That's no longer nearly as true as it was. And even in Africa, even with the very rapid population growth of Africa over the last years, food available per head has gone up at roughly the same rate as it has in other continents. Child mortality, the greatest measure of misery anybody can think of, has come down everywhere. And again, in the 1980s and 90s, you see the slowing down of that improvement in Africa, which led to a great deal of pessimism around the world, but in fact has now gone away, or the world Africa has started to catch up with the rest of the world again. But of course, getting rich doesn't necessarily make you happy. And for a long time, we thought that the richer you were, the less happy you were. This was called the Easterlin paradox. We now know that that's not true, that with better data, we can show that there is a correlation within countries, between countries, and within lifetimes between wealth and happiness. It's not a perfect correlation, and it's possible to be very rich and very unhappy, but that's all right because it cheers up other people. You can also see how over this period, the last several hundred years, the world was very equal, became very much less equal, and has then become more equal again. The divergence and then the convergence. As Deirdre McCloskey puts it in her new book, Bourgeois Equality, which is not yet published, she says, yes, we were equal in the 15th century, but it was an equality of wading through water up to our chin in terror. whereas today we have an equality of consumption at a much higher level. And the degree to which people think that equality in the world is getting worse, whereas in fact it's getting better, is to me very striking. That's what world income distribution looked like in 1970, with a great big valley between the first and the third worlds. We had that terminology accurately to reflect that. That's what it looks like today, with a great big mountain in the middle instead of a valley, with most people in the middle of the chart, and the middle has shifted to the right. So what has happened is that an enormous number of people have come to have the living standards that were once associated with the very rich, with kings like Louis XIV. And the secret of being a king is that you get other people to do things for you, essentially. It's a fair bet that Louis XIV didn't make that fancy outfit for himself. Louis XIV had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. But so have each of you tonight. There are 498 people working in restaurants and bars and chefs within a mile of this spot who are ready to serve you at an hour's notice this evening. I'm willing to bet, unless you choose to have the delicious food at the back of the hall instead. And that's the point of economic growth over the last 200 years, has been to deliver prosperity not just to the wealthy, but to everybody. As Joseph Schumpeter said it, the capitalist achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls. Now, my latest book is called The Evolution of Everything, and what I'm trying to do in it is to try and understand the degree to which these phenomena, and others like them, are actually the results of spontaneous and emergent trends rather than of deliberate design. If you think about a rainforest, you look at it now, and 200 years ago you'd have looked at it as an example of beautiful, intelligent design. The boa constrictor and the trees on which it's crawling, each of which is beautifully designed in the most extraordinary way to have a fit between form and function. And Charles Darwin gave us the idea, which most of us have since accepted, not all of the world, but a lot of us, that actually you can have this exquisite fit between form and function. You can have complexity on an unbelievable scale. Just inside the cell of that boa constrictor, there is extraordinary complexity with millions of different molecules, each doing their own jobs and so on. You can have that complexity and that fit between form and function without anyone ever having planned it, without anyone having had the idea, I want to design a boa constrictor. It's never been in a mind at all as a concept. And I'm saying we need to have the same idea about human society, that an awful lot of what we see in human society is not as much the result of planning and design as we think, but is the result of other things. Adam Ferguson was an 18th century Scottish philosopher who coined a phrase for this. He said that there are many things in the world that are the result of human action, but not the execution of any design. And when he was talking about things like language, for example, the English language is a beautiful instrument, incredibly well designed, with very strict rules about how you can use it and how you can't, and with enormous fit between form and function. Things like, if you use a word a lot, it becomes a short word, and if you want to change the meaning of a word, you can't change the meaning of short, frequently used words, but you can change the meaning of long, infrequently used words. These are little rules you probably don't even know, and yet you follow them in your everyday life. And yet, of course, no one's in charge of the English language, thank goodness. There is no central committee of the English language. There is of French, but not of English. And yet it's absurd. It would be absurd to say that the English language is a natural phenomenon. Of course, it's a man-made thing. It's just man-made, but not man-designed. And the same, I argue, is true of money, morality, marriage, manners, markets, the internet, government, God, and technology. That once you look into all these things, you find that there is an enormous amount of spontaneous order, an enormous amount of emergent complexity, and that it comes about through processes of trial and error, with a lot of experimentation followed by selection, in just the same way as we see with biological evolution. Here's an example from the evolution of the violin. The recent paper published just 2 years ago by Chitwood, arguing that the change in the shape of the hole in the middle of a violin from circular to F-shaped came about essentially through trial and error, through a process of inheritance and mutation, as he puts it, not through a process of clever people in ivory towers having better ideas. Slight variations in the way people made things, some of which were selected and survived and some of which did not. Moore's law tells you that computing advances in a steady way, in a sort of evolutionary progression. But what Ray Kurzweil has recently noticed is that Moore's law goes back beyond the time when Gordon Moore first noticed it in the 1960s. It goes back through previous technologies. So on this chart you can see there has been an inexorable improvement in the density of computing that you can get from a chip, in the price of computing over the whole of the 20th century. And what's bizarre about this, when you think about it, is that you can't even see the breaks between the technologies on this chart. You can't even see step changes when we change from a transistor to an integrated circuit or something like that. And nor can you see wars or depressions or booms or anything like that. There's a sort of steady incremental march of technology here. And once we got to the point where we'd recognized Moore's law, when Gordon Moore first identified it, we should have been able to say, right, okay, so that's how fast computers improve. Let's jump ahead. And we haven't even been able to do that. So there's something strangely incremental about the way technology changes. And that's because each technology is required before you can make the next step. It moves through the adjacent possibles, just as evolution does. And you can see this very clearly in the case of simultaneous invention and simultaneous discovery. Every single technology on the planet that is invented or discovered, or scientific discovery that is made, is accompanied by a lot of very angry people saying, that was my idea. And they're not wrong. There is the phenomenon of simultaneous discovery is everywhere. Every technology you look up the history of, there's a whole bunch of people who are very unfairly done out of the history books because they were there too, having the same idea. The light bulb is a good example. There were 23 different people came up with the idea of the incandescent light bulb within the same decade, in the 1870s, totally independently. I come from Newcastle in the north of England. That's where Joseph Swan lived, and he definitely was the person who first invented the light bulb. That's his one on the right. And this terrible chap, Edison, from New Jersey, took all the credit and most of the money. But if you come from France, you say Maxime did it. If you come from Russia, you say Lodygin did it. And what that's telling you is that the light bulb was inevitable at that stage in technological change. That the technologies to put it together had emerged, and that it didn't matter whether Edison was run over by a bus or not, you would still get light bulbs. So in that sense, inventors and discoverers are incredibly dispensable, unlike artists. If they didn't exist, you would still get their technologies, because the technology itself is evolving. As Kevin Kelly calls it, he actually gives it the name the technium. It's like an organism that's evolving, and it's choosing its inventors. I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but only a little bit. I mean, think about search engines, for example, one of the great inventions of my lifetime. I use one every day, I suspect. If Sergey Brin or Larry Page had been run over by a car in 1990 and we didn't have Google, do you think we wouldn't have search engines? Of course not. There were already 25 different search engine companies out there. But Google happened to invent the best. We wouldn't have the verb to Google if they hadn't invented Google, of course, but that's art rather than science. On my desk at home sit these two objects. I noticed one day, about 7 or 8 years ago, how incredibly similar they were in size and shape. It was just a pure coincidence. One is an Australian hand axe from about 500,000 years ago, of the kind used by Homo erectus, although my wife got it for me on eBay. And the other, well, I no longer use it, but I used to use it. It's a computer mouse, a cordless computer mouse. And in between them lies the entire history of human technology, which I think is rather wonderful. But there are fascinating differences between them when you think about it. The axe is made of a single substance, whereas the mouse is made of many different substances, many different ideas. Indeed, every technology we possess, I defy you to pull anything out of your pockets at the end of this talk that is not a combination of different technologies. In other words, that's how we make new technologies, is by combining different technologies together. And of course, the point about the axe is that it was made by the person who used it for his own use, whereas the mouse was made for me by many different people. Hundreds, thousands, probably millions of different people, because there was a man growing coffee whose coffee was used by someone on an oil rig whose oil was going to be used by a woman in a plastics factory for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you think about it, an incredible number of people working for me in just the same way as people were working for Louis XIV when they built him his silly outfit. And yet the amazing thing, of course, about this, as Hayek was pointed out, is that not one of those million people knew how to make a computer mouse, and that there isn't a single human being on this planet who knows how to make a computer mouse. The man who runs the computer mouse company doesn't know, he just knows how to run a factory. The man on the assembly line doesn't know, he doesn't know how to drill an oil well, etc. The knowledge is stored in the cloud between human brains, not inside human brains. So I've argued that there's an inexorable, inevitable progression of technology which can enrich humanity if allowed, and that there is no reason to think this can't apply on all continents, including developing countries. But can it go on, or are we up against some ecological limit? Am I like the man who falls out of the skyscraper and as he passes the second story he shouts, "So far, so good"? Well, I think that actually there's every reason to think this problem is going to get, that the ecological limits are not going to be a problem in the current century. Take population, for example, which is the one we were most worried about in the 1960s and 1970s. The population growth rate of the world has halved in my lifetime, whereas world population quadrupled in the 20th century. It's not even going to double in the 21st century at the rate we're going. And many people think that the median projection of the world, of the United Nations, for 11 billion people by the end of the century will probably prove to be an overestimate. So in terms of coping with population growth, the problem is getting easier, not harder. And in terms of feeding the world, it's also getting much easier because of improvements in agricultural technology. This is the amount of land that you need to feed one, to produce the same amount of food over different periods. It's 68% less land than you needed in 1960. That's averaged over all crops. Why is that significant? Because it means that we can reduce our footprint. We can actually release land from farming for nature, even as we feed a growing population. And the other thing that people worried about was, of course, that we'd run out of resources, that we'd run out of oil or gas or metals and zinc and lead and all these kind of things. Again, most of those worries have proved to be greatly exaggerated. The abundance of non-renewable resources has continued to increase in the last 50 years. Many renewable resources run out, like whales or forests, but non-renewable resources tend not to run out. So I don't see major ecological limits. And in terms of relating this to the problem of climate change, it's worth just noting that the 4 scenarios envisaged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change all envisage GDP per capita in the world increasing substantially in this century. And the one with the most growth, with GDP per capita 16 times higher by the end of this century than it is today, is RCP 2.6, which is the one in which there is no dangerous global warming at all, in which we have become so technologically advanced that we've solved the problem. And the one with the second least amount of growth is the one which we do have dangerous global warming, but even so, even then, we need to have sufficient growth in order to generate the dangerous global warming. So none of this that I've described would be possible without enormous increases in energy. And that is the one thing that I think there is still a big divergence in the world. The average American uses 10 times as much energy per capita as the average Nigerian. And that, I suspect, is one of the main causes of lack of development in the world. And we need to work out ways of getting energy to people, preferably in clean forms. Let me end with this quotation. "We cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say, society has reached a turning point, that we've seen our best days, but so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us?" It's one of my favorite quotations. I didn't make it myself. Indeed, it was made in 1830 by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Already then he was fed up with the pessimists saying things can't get better, they can only get worse. And yet they had hardly started to get better compared with what we have today. Thank you very much.